Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something quite heated. It's the professional and theoretical fight that has some pretty big implications for how we understand and, well, educate autistic individuals. Our mission here is to unpack a set of source materials looking at this really foundational debate in language acquisition. Okay, so the core of it all is this thing called Gestalt Language Processing, GLP, and also Natural Language Acquisition, NLA. Now, these describe a developmental pathway that's, observed in quite a lot of autistic children. The real spark, the conflict, comes from a recent academic critique, a very critical one, actually, that basically dismissed this whole pathway, calling it implausible.
And what's really striking here, I think, is that this isn't just some, dry academic argument happening in journals. No, this spills right out into clinics, into schools. The source material we're diving into, which is this detailed rebuttal of that original critique, it really lays out that the fight is over, well, a couple of key things. First, what actually counts as solid evidence, and second, whose model of language learning gets to dictate, the therapy practices and the funding that follows, of course.
Right. And this review we're looking at, it makes a pretty bold claim. It argues that dismissing GLP and NLA wasn't just objective scholarship. It calls it, and this is a direct quote, policing boundaries and protecting analytic turf. It frames it as academic enclosure, not exploration.
Yeah.
That's a serious charge. We really need to understand the groundwork on both sides here. So maybe let's start with the basics, the definitions, because the original critique, the one by Dr. Katharine Beals, is accused of kind of blurring these terms together. What exactly are GLP and NLA?
Okay, good place to start. So GLP, Gestalt Language Processing, that's the developmental pathway itself. It's the observation. When we talk GLP, think about how some kids acquire language. Instead of starting with tiny sounds, then little word parts, morphemes, then grammar rules, that's the typical analytic path we often assume, GLP describes kids who grab big, meaningful chunks of language first. Whole phrases, sometimes whole sentences from movies or songs.
It's like a script.
Exactly, like a script or a gestalt. So instead of learning I want juice separately, a child might use the whole chunk, do you want some juice, as a single unit to ask for juice. It's a whole meaning-packed unit. They use that script functionally. It's only later, maybe months or even years later, that they start to break that chunk down, figure out the pieces, and recombine them in new ways.
Okay, that makes sense. So GLP is the pattern of development.
Yeah.
Then what's NLA?
Right, NLA is different. That's the Natural Language Acquisition Clinical Program. It was developed by a clinician, Marge Blanc. NLA is basically a protocol. It's manualized. It takes those observations about the GLP pathway, this chunking pattern, and turns them into 6 specific stages for speech therapists to use in therapy.
Ah, okay. So the review calls the critics' move the category collapse, meaning the critique kind of treated the observed pattern, GLP, and this specific therapy method, NLA, as if they were the same thing.
Precisely. And the review argues this wasn't accidental, it was strategic. Because if you can raise doubts about the protocol, the NLA stages maybe not being perfectly described in formal linguistic theory, then you can try to cast doubt on the whole developmental pathway, the GLP observation itself, even if lots of practitioners are seeing it every day.
That does sound like a way to shut down the conversation. If the therapy based on it isn't perfect, then the whole phenomenon must be wrong.
It's a way to dismiss the phenomenon by attacking the application, exactly. And the review argues this connects to the bigger picture, to the critic's own position.
All right, we should probably talk about the context of the critic, Dr. Beals. The source identifies her as a linguist, also a practitioner, teaching at Drexel, Penn, Temple. And she also runs her own company, right? Designing software, curricula.
Yes, curricula focused on teaching what the source calls rule-bound sentence grammar, analytic stuff, building sentences piece by piece.
And that institutional setting seems important too. Drexel School of Education. The reviewer describes it as part of an ABA forward ecology. Could you unpack that a bit for listeners? What does that imply?
Sure. So ABA is applied behavior analysis. In this context, ABA Forward suggests an environment where the default for evidence-based practice often leans towards behavioral methods. Think Scannanian principles, breaking skills down into tiny, measurable steps, using prompts, reinforcement, often focusing on observable behaviors. In language, this usually means focusing on vocabulary drills, syntax construction, measurable outputs.
Okay, so within that framework, language is vocabulary plus grammar plus syntax. And the fix is direct instruction, drills, systematic building.
Exactly, and her commercial products align with that view. So this is where the review argues the central tension lies. It suggests that Dr. Beals' whole setup, her linguistic theory, how she measures progress, even her business, it all kind of requires GLP and LA to be seen as implausible because it just doesn't fit that analytic piece-by-piece model.
If your worldview and your tools are built for analytic construction, seeing kids use whole scripts looks like
Right.
what, an error, a delay?
Precisely. It can only be interpreted as a deficit or mindless echoing within that framework, not as a fundamentally different, valid way of processing and acquiring language.
Okay, but just playing devil's advocate for a second. Dr. Beals is a linguist at major institutions. She must have some strong theoretical reasons grounded in linguistics for insisting language has to be analytic, right? What's the theory that makes GLP seem so unlikely from her perspective?
That's a fair question. The source suggests her stance aligns strongly with certain structuralist or perhaps Chomskyan linguistic viewpoints. The idea there is that the fundamental human capacity for language is about generating novel grammatical sentences using underlying rules, like syntax. So from that perspective, the child's main job has to be figuring out those rules, analyzing the input to find the patterns, the morphemes, the syntax. Processing whole, unanalyzed chunks doesn't really fit that picture of linguistic competence.
So the theory itself almost predefines what counts as real language acquisition.
In a way, yes. And this leads directly into what the source identifies as a major methodological issue in the critique. They call it methodological exclusion. Basically, the original critique started from the premise that analytic processing building language from the smallest parts up isn't just one way, it's the way. It's treated as axiomatic, like a given truth.
And if you start there, well, it kind of rigs the game, doesn't it? The review calls this a false binary.
Exactly that. It sets up this situation where a child is seen as either completely unanalyzed, basically just parroting sounds without meaning, like mindless echolalia, or they must be fully analytic, breaking everything down from the start. There's no room in that binary for a child to be doing something different, like analyzing the meaning or the social function or the intonation of a whole chunk first before they get to the grammatical pieces inside it.
So the very definition of processing used in the critique excludes the possibility of GLP from the outset.
That's the argument. The source says this initial assumption just forecloses the whole investigation. It doesn't matter if you show a child sometimes focuses analytically. That doesn't mean they aren't also doing Gestalt processing. But the critique's narrow definition, the source claims, acts like a method of erasure disguised as evidence.
Wow. Okay, so the definition sets it up, but then it seems the way success was measured also stacked the deck. This is the outcome mismatch part.
Yes, and this might be the most crucial part. The reviewer uses this powerful phrase, the sieve is rigged. What they mean is the critique demanded only analytic products as proof that language development was happening. Things like, can the child segment words correctly? Can they master syntax drills? Can they show progress moving from morphemes to clauses in a nice, neat order?
So they're basically asking the GLP kid, show me how well you can do the analytic kid's homework.
That's a great way to put it. Exactly. So if a Gestalt processor uses a whole movie line, say to infinity and beyond, to express excitement about going somewhere new, that's real communication. It's functional, it's meaningful, it serves a purpose, but it doesn't demonstrate analytic segmentation or mastery of syntax rules in the way the critique demanded.
So that real-world communication just doesn't count. It disappears from the data.
It essentially vanishes from the evidence ledger, according to the review, because the things GLP predicts you'll see as progress and what practitioners report seeing are different. They see things like mitigations where the child tweaks a script slightly to fit a new situation, or recombinations mixing parts of different learned scripts to create brand new meanings, and pragmatic deployments using scripts flexibly for social connection or regulating emotions.
But the measurement tools being used weren't designed to see or value those steps.
Precisely. By using only analytic rulers, the critique ensures these core markers of Gestalt development just don't show up as valid progress. The very thing being debated gets defined out of existence because it doesn't fit the measurement tool.
If the evidence doesn't fit the machine decides the evidence doesn't exist.
Yeah.
That's a really strong claim. And it definitely pushes this beyond a simple theoretical disagreement. It makes it about professional power, about turf.
And ethics, too. The source brings up what it calls an ethical asymmetry.
What does that mean?
Well, the original critique frames GLP and NLA as potentially detrimental, implying they might harm a child's progress toward proper analytic language. But the review argues that this critique completely ignores or leaves untouched the potential and documented harms of the very analytic and ABA-aligned practices that the critics' framework supports.
You mean things like the source mentions compliance trauma and The psychic toll, what are they referring to there?
They're talking about the reported experiences of some autistic individuals who felt forced into communication methods that felt profoundly unnatural or alien to them, being drilled, sometimes punitively, to produce speech in a way that doesn't match how their brain processes language. The argument is that this isn't just about effective teaching, it's about potentially causing real emotional distress by demanding conformity to a neurotypical analytic model just so the therapy data looks right.
So the ethical concern is weighted entirely against the newer approach,
Yeah.
while the potential harms of the established approach are sort of glossed over.
That's the charge, yes, that the ethics are skewed to protect the established methods, not necessarily the child's well-being or processing style. And this feeds right into the idea of a larger professional turf war. You have established theoretical linguistics backed by institutional weight, potentially clashing with these emerging neurodiversity-informed clinical practices that are asking for different ways of listening and measuring success.
And that turf war isn't just about ideas,
Right.
is it? The review talks about the practical side, the money, the institutions.
Absolutely. This is where the source brings in epistemic politics. The argument is that the dominance of the analytic framework isn't just theoretical purity, it's profitable. It's supported by decades of research funding, established university programs, professional certification pathways, insurance billing codes. There's a whole infrastructure built around it. It's lucrative.
Whereas GLP,
GLP is described more as a grassroots phenomenon, arising from clinical observation. It's much harder to standardize, package, and sell in the same way because it relies so much on individualized, responsive listening and flexibility rather than rigid, step-by-step protocols.
the review makes an interesting point about AC augmentative and alternative communication. It says AAC often gets cited approvingly by folks in the analytic camp, while echolalia or Gestalt use gets dismissed. Why that difference?
Yeah, that's a key point. The source suggests AAC, while obviously valuable, fits more comfortably into the existing system. Why? Because it often involves technology, specific symbol sets, structured protocols. You can systematize it, measure its use, standardize training. It can be integrated into the analytic framework you teach, symbols like vocabulary, combine them like grammar. It's measurable, billable.
But natural echolalia, using scripts, that's messier.
It's much messier, yes. It's deeply contextual, often carries a lot of emotional weight. It's highly individual. To understand it, the clinician has to really listen to the autistic person on their own terms, interpreting meaning beyond the surface structure. It doesn't fit neatly into standardized boxes or simple data collection. The source argues the system prefers what it can easily control and quantify.
This really highlights the power dynamics at play. The source calls it the asymmetry of the megaphone.
Exactly. It paints a picture where on one side you have Dr. Beals, affiliated with major universities, holding traditional academic credentials, publishing in established journals like Current Developmental Disorders reports. She's, as the source puts it, inside the machine.
And on the other side,
You have proponents like Marge Blanc, the developer of NLA and the author of this review. Their authority often comes more from extensive clinical practice, from direct interaction with Gestalt processors. They tend to publish in practitioner-focused outlets, guidebooks, maybe less formal platforms. The source explicitly mentions the experience of having manuscripts based on, say, autistic embodiment or GLP practice get bounced from those top-tier academic journals.
so their knowledge, generated from practice, struggles to get the same institutional validation.
That's the dynamic described. It's harder to get heard through the established academic channels, which makes it easier for the inside voices to dismiss their work as less rigorous or anecdotal, even if it's grounded in deep clinical experience.
And the author of this review, they're quite open about their own personal connection to this, aren't they?
Yes, and I think that's a really important piece of context they provide. They identify as an ADHD Gestalt language processor themselves. They write about their own negative experiences with the kinds of analytic methods being championed, things like ABA-based approaches and certain phonics-heavy reading programs, which they say failed them profoundly.
So this isn't just academic for them.
Not at all. They now work as a literacy specialist and describe GLP-NLA approaches as being life-giving for students who are essentially left behind or misunderstood by purely analytic methods. They frame the critique not just as a theoretical error, but as something that reflects the very systems that historically excluded people like them from successful communication and literacy. It's deeply personal.
That personal experience, combined with the professional observations, it leads the source to frame this whole conflict through the lens of the double empathy problem. Can you explain that concept?
Sure. The double empathy problem, generally, is the idea that empathy is a two-way street, And breakdowns in understanding often happen because people with very different experiences or neurotypes struggle to intuitively grasp the other's perspective. In this context, the source suggests Dr. Beals might genuinely look at her data, see her analytic methods working for analytic processors, and conclude, quite logically from her viewpoint, that this is the only valid path. Her evidence reinforces her conclusion.
Making GLP seem flawed or unnecessary from her perspective.
Exactly. But then, on the other side of that empathy gap, you have practitioners like the review author. They work with kids who don't respond well to those analytic tools, kids who might even be harmed by them. For these practitioners, GLP isn't just plausible, it's essential. It's the only framework that makes sense of their students' communication and provides a path forward.
So both sides might be seeing valid evidence within their own sphere of experience, but struggling to bridge the gap and recognize the validity of the other's world.
That's the core idea the source puts forward. It's not necessarily about one side being wrong in their observations, but about a fundamental disconnect in understanding arising from different experiences, different tools, and perhaps different core assumptions about language itself. A chasm between two worlds of evidence.
So wrapping up this deep dive, the source's final conclusion isn't that the critique was just a flawed piece of scholarship, it's framing it as something more deliberate.
Yes, the conclusion is pretty stark. It argues the critique represents analytic enclosure, that's the term used. It's portrayed not as an attempt to understand or explore GLP, but as a strategic move to essentially define it out of existence, to erase what many autistic people actually do with language.
And the goal of this enclosure.
The source argues the goal is to steer clinicians, educators, and funding back towards the established, measurable, commercially supported behavioral practices. It's presented as a refusal to see diversity, framed as a scientific discovery of implausibility.
So for you listening, the big takeaway here seems to be about recognizing the kind of critique you're encountering. Is it genuinely trying to explore and understand a phenomenon, even if critically?
Or is it seeking enclosure? Is it setting up definitions and measurement tools in such a way that the phenomenon cannot possibly appear valid? When a pathway observed widely in practice gets declared impossible, mainly by definition, the source argues, that tells you less about the pathway itself and maybe a lot more about the professional or theoretical boundaries being fiercely protected.
Which leads us to a final provocative thought for you to consider. Building on all this, if institutional legitimacy, if research funding, if insurance billing, if professional certifications are all deeply intertwined with one particular way of understanding language, this segmented analytic framework, how much real-world evidence of other valid, diverse ways of learning and communicating like Gestalt processing might we be systemically blinding ourselves to? How much are we preventing ourselves from even seeing, let alone valuing?